been studying, working on for years. What, like maybe 5 years ago when we met, 4 or 5 years ago when we met, I knew you were thinking about sense making and rebuilding civilizations, and I'm curious. I've had the pleasure of just kind of being around you for years. What's the best way to tell probably a new audience about your work? I feel like, I'm wondering your favorite way to explain that.
I don't know that I have a favorite way to explain it, but
I'll jump in if I'll give my perspective, but I'd love to hear if you have a shot.
Kind of just a brief narrative from the beginning is I was homeschooled growing up, so I got to kind of make my own curriculum, which was fortunate. And a lot of it had to do with activism. My mom was big into activism, so I got into environmental work and animal rights work and social justice issues young. And my dad was into lots of areas of science and engineering and philosophy, so I was getting to have that braid of topics. And as I was exploring activism, one of the things that I found was how profoundly interconnected the problems were and how the solutions weren't adequately addressing them. And this started showing up all over the place. I got it in terms of looking at why are the ecological issues advancing and not getting better despite the huge amount of effort happening in the nonprofit space and government and for-benefit space. What is fundamentally inadequate about the nature of the solution? I remember being 13, working on helping some project that was in Kenya, protecting elephants from poaching in an area that was already protected, that the poachers could get in. And so I was 13, so I was just in the US, like going door to door, raising money and writing letters. And but the people who were there on the ground were having their life threatened by the poaching groups. And the solution was bigger fences around the preserve so poachers couldn't get in, and legislation in the country for harsher sentencing for poachers. And the solution, after a couple of years of like blood, sweat, and tears, finally worked. But it didn't address the poverty of the people that were poaching and the fact that, they were in parts of the world where 25,000 kids are starving to death a day. It didn't address black markets on animal products. It didn't address mindsets towards animals. It didn't address a macroeconomy that creates poverty at scale and ships it to the third world. It didn't address any of those issues. So the same poaching groups moved and started hunting both the mountain gorilla and the white rhino more than they had been, both of which were more endangered. And I got to see this because I wasn't just looking at one issue. I was working with enough groups that I got to see that those were connected. And so the tremendously hard and well-motivated work solved one problem, but actually moved the underlying problem space to show up in areas that were even more sensitive. And that was really devastating because the only kind of hope that I had to deal with the devastation of the nature of the problems was that something could be done about it. And so fortunately, I was also studying not just all the different areas of science that I could, but system science and Bucky Fuller's work and Capra's work and kind of how do all the things fit together. And so I started looking at activism from that lens and saying, how can we understand the nature of the problems well enough that we can come up with solutions that solve that problem, but also don't externalize harm elsewhere? And that required starting to get into economics and the nature of why does perverse incentive arise, and what would it take to internalize perverse incentive and externality, and the nature of governance systems and culture, and basically civilization writ large. And so then that led to saying, okay, well, there's a lot of things that we can say are getting better. You can listen to Hans Rosling or Steven Pinker and pick things that are getting better. But you can also look at most environmentalists or people studying existential risk and look at things getting worse. And both are the case. There are some metrics getting better. There are some getting worse. That's a destabilization of the overall space. But the things that are getting worse are leading to catastrophic tipping points that will break the substrate that allows the things that are getting better to matter. Mm-hmm. So I started forecasting how long do we have on the various things, and started reading Limits of Growth by Club of Rome and all of the different kind of forecasts, as well as studying civilizational collapse theory. Tainter and Baudrillard and things like that. Because it becomes pretty clear when you study history that all of the great empires that lived for hundreds or thousands of years don't still exist.
I'm curious, how old are you when you're diving into this inquiry? It's just so fascinated that you're so interested and have the dedication to dive into this. When does this occur in your life?
I mean, this is kind of the thread of my whole life, just progressively deeper insight into the process. If you spend time talking with kids where you listen and then actually give them space for the questions to emerge, the dedication is there. Like I do nature walks with kids, and they want to ask around about how do trees suck up water, and how does the light thing work, and how do all the animals and everything interact, and very deep questions. They want to know why the sky is blue, which actually requires understanding things about optics and about astronomy and about the sun, about astrophysics, and as well as like the nature of consciousness. What is the subjective experience of blue? And school just doesn't do a great job of actually facilitating that curiosity. And so if we force people to be interested in shit they aren't interested in and don't facilitate their interest in the things they're actually interested in, we kind of break their interest, and then they want to use some hypernormal stimuli. So I was just fortunate that the things that were interesting to me, I got to pay attention to. And I think anyone that gets to continue to pay attention to the things they're interested in learns, but they also double down on their own interest. So the things I'm describing now were a lot of my kind of teenage focus. And so I started looking at, forecasting and civilizational collapse models, anything from environmental collapse, from overfishing and, peak resource utilization, to pollution issues, to, climate type issues, as well as what are the things that lead to large scale war and infrastructure collapse and those types of things. And that led to recognizing that as our technology exponentiates and the power of our choices exponentiate, but our quality of choice making is not getting commensurately better to the power of our choice making, we're having more and more different escalation pathways to catastrophic risk globally, and higher probability of them, where if we try to think about like biotech risks or nanotech risks or AI mediated risk or large scale war or grid collapse, if we tried to solve any of them on their own, they're almost all impossible to solve, and there's too many of them. So I started thinking about what is driving all of them. Why are humans coordinating at scale in a way that uses our technological power in ways that either directly through conflict theory cause problems, war, and exploitation that is known, or through mistake theory cause problems, unintended externalities. And a lot of it is that, right? Like, I don't think the people when they were making Facebook knew that it would destroy the entire information ecology, but it did. So that's a kind of information theoretic issue. So we started thinking about, is there some set of underlying dynamics that give rise to how humans are coordinating that are what gives rise to all these problems, the generator functions of them? And to just start to think about like perverse incentive. As long as military industrial complex is one of the largest blocks of the global economy and war is profitable, and you have the capacity for the supply side to manufacture artificial demand, can you have a for-profit military industrial complex that the entire global economy depends upon and lasting peace in a supply and demand equation? Well, no. So we have to deal with perverse incentive there. That's one example. We can see it in healthcare, and we can see it in mining, and we can see it everywhere. And so you start looking at, is the nature of the incentive system, the economic system where 50 to $100 trillion a day of human activity moves, but is either directly causing harm or indirectly causing externality, could we shift that in a way where that incentive system, what was in the incentive of an individual or a corporation or a nation was in the well aligned with the well-being of the whole better, right? So these were the questions I was asking and trying to study the Austrian school and straight kind of laissez-faire approaches, or socialist approaches, or Marxist approaches, or like techno-optimist, automate everything approaches. And I got to see that there were strengths and weaknesses of a lot of them, and none of them were actually adequate to the space. So we put together some research groups that were working on understanding the space, the generator functions of catastrophic risk well enough to say, is there a categorical set of solutions to the underlying dynamics of how humanity coordinates effectively that is the kernel of a new civilization model? And that when we study civilizational decay of what made Rome fall, and Egypt and the Aztecs and the Mayans and et cetera, that if we understand the dynamics that give rise to civilizational collapse, can we have something that really addresses all of those dynamics and addresses all of the escalation pathways to the catastrophic risks we can see? So
it sounds like, almost, correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe a simple way to put that is, if you were to redesign civilization from scratch, how would you do it? Is that it's almost the frame of like, well, everything that we've done has these strengths and weaknesses. What would we do if we do it again from scratch? Is that kind of where you're coming from here?
Well, this is a valuable question, and it's an insufficient question. And I spent a lot of time when I was young asking it without recognizing the enactment problem. Okay, so we actually get there in factoring that seems that all the people are conditioned currently who are in power in a way that would resist that, and it seems to be not in the immediate best interest of the game theoretic environment. So yes, it's an important thought experiment. If we were going to redesign civilization from scratch, how do we think the best run planet would run, most enlightened planet would be? Then we have to say, in the current scenario, what is actually a viable path there? And to some degree, you reverse engineer from the idea of a future state. To some degree, you forward engineer, how can we be vectoring in the right direction and increasing our capacity to continue to vector in the right direction?
So what I'm hearing is great thought experiment.
Hey, Google, lights on.
That's not, Eugene, do you mind muting yourself? Although that's a great thought experiment, change doesn't start. We can't just hit a button and then redesign. You're saying, cool, great thought experience to have that vision, to think about what is that beautiful thing, and changes evolution. It's messy, right? To actually get to that vision, we actually have to start with where we are.
Yeah.
So where are we, and where do you see us actually being able to go from where we are?
So I'll try to bridge this to some of what Wade was talking about. He was talking about the unraveling of the American empire. I think we can look at, and I don't claim to be representing his views accurately here, but just kind of piggyback on some of the thoughts. We can look at the United States system and say, is it undergoing civilizational decay in the way that led to the breakdown of previous civilizations? And what would the signs of that be? What kind of things can we look for? We can also look at the global system that the world has actually run on since World War II that has been US based. And it's very important to look at these together. From the US perspective, we can, one just kind of quick insightful thing is that throughout history, democracies or republics, systems of participatory governance that were at scale, not like small tribal scales, never made it to 300 years, right? They have a fairly short life cycle. All empires died, but some of the dynastic ones made it 1,000 years. And the ones that were more participatory governance systems lasted less long. The US is at around 250 years, depending upon exactly the start date you pick. So this is the time cycle factoring history of the adequate decay of a republic. And to understand why, there's a bunch of reasons why, and I won't get into all of them, but the people who are willing to fight a revolutionary war to make something happen, right? If they lived in the direct experience of tyranny of government and where they were willing to die rather than let themselves be governed in a way that felt tyrannical, then they're also willing to do the extraordinarily hard work of participatory governance, which means show up at the town hall, just let somebody else make the decisions, read all the papers, be actively informed about what's going on so that you can participate in governance, because you have the direct experience of how terrible not being involved in your own governance is. But as time goes on and several generations pass, and that just becomes a myth that no one has any embodied experience of, and there's like mortgages to pay and stuff on TV and shit to do, I don't even want to go to jury duty, let alone be really actively informed and engaged in participatory governance. So if the people stop checking the state and it's no longer truly a governance of, for, and by the people, then the state stops being able to do what it's supposed to do, which is check the predatory aspects of the market. I'll just make this frame because that's an important frame.
Absolutely, I love it.
One way of thinking about all of the problems in the world is that they're all coordination problems. That it's patterns of human behavior at scale that cause them, and it needs to be different patterns of human behavior at scale to solve them. And so how do we get lots of people to coordinate their behavior when they want different things and they have different understandings of the world and different worldviews in ways that lead to better solutions for the individual groups and the whole overall? It's a hard thing. When the Churchill said about democracy, and the founding fathers here said something similar, that democracy is the single worst form of government ever created, save for all the other forms. What they meant is the idea of governance, that you get a lot of different people to actually participate together, is just a really hard proposition. And it's why, if you look at human history, until like the thing we call civilization only started 10, 13,000 years ago. But we have 200 or 300,000 years of sapient existence of people that were genetically and neurologically similar to us. And those groups never got beyond, give or take, what's called the Dunbar number, 150 people in a tribe. And it's like, why was that such a hard upper bound? Why did, for hundreds of thousands of years, humans never make groups bigger than that? And it's actually like, the simplest way I would think of it is it had to do with limits of coordination. So communication and coordination. If the tribe has to make a decision that's very consequential, to move or not, or to change some deep aspect of how they do things, up to about that size, everyone can participate in a tribal council and all have a say in what the rest of their life is going to be subject to. But as soon as you start getting more people than that, everyone can't actually have a say, because you can't just you can't have time to listen to 1,000 people. Right? It would take a month to make a decision on anything, and no one would even have the work memory to hold it. And so then I have to pick representatives to make choices on my behalf. Now my life is subject to choices that I don't have a say in. No, I'd rather cleave and make my own smaller group and be more self-determined. And so the Dunbar number was a limit of how. And up to that size, I could talk to everyone and get their sense made on things. So I didn't just have this like anonymous, the right or the left over there, that I could just have a pejorative straw man version of. I had people that I knew intimately. So that's almost all of evolutionary history. Now, when the tribe would get as big as it could get, then it would cleave, and some of the people would move somewhere else. Lots of migration happened until eventually population keeps growing. We've migrated everywhere that we can. Now population keeps growing and tribal warfare becomes pressed, right? Because now we're competing for scarce resource. Now there's a basis to have tribes unify against larger external tribes, and we call that kind of the beginning of civilization, which means it was in a war, game theoretic kind of context. And so now we unify together and try to create government structures for these larger numbers of people because we have to. And so there's binding energy to hold the cleaving energy associated with an enemy hypothesis. So,
can I jump in?
sure.
So when I think of coordination, it feels like it's so related to connection. And if you want to take it further, maybe empathy. Right? When people don't have a sense of each other or where they're at or what the pain and problem is, people don't really care. Like, if I really care about something, Daniel, and you might be like, oh, you should meet this person, and that could change my life. Right? You might give me 10 minutes, you might give me an hour, you might help, but it feels like that coordination starts with some sort of connection. That came up for me, so I wanted to see what you feel.
There definitely needs to be some fealty, and it's a nice idea that it emerges from empathy. It doesn't have to emerge from empathy. It can emerge from a shared enemy, which it often does. And so then there's fealty to each other, not because we necessarily care about each other, but because we care about ourselves and our sub in group, and we feel that we have to be bound with them against whoever the out group is. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the Dunbar number was partly a limit on how many relationships I could deeply track. And I'm willing to make certain sacrifices of what I want most for people I really know and love and I've known forever and I see every day and they know me. It's much harder to make sacrifices for anonymous people that I have no idea who they are, that are somewhere else, right? And so as you get beyond that, you have to have a shared religion or patriotism or some kind of group identity that everyone gets to be part of, so that they identify with each other through shared group identity, right? We can see that in the US that is broke down, where there's very little sense of what it means to be a US citizen that everyone's on the same page with, that really creates binding energy. There's much more of a sense of what it means to be on the left or the right that has so much enmity towards each other that the thing as a whole doesn't have something like shared nationalism or patriotism, and that's part of the issue.
Sure. Well, I guess so. Fundamentally, do humans just need pain or an enemy to really come together and coordinate in a larger way at scale?
It's a good question, and I think I'll better be able to answer it if we go back to the train we was on about coordination.
Go for it.
So if we look at all of the issues we want to solve as coordination issues, because we say, well, no, climate change is not a coordination issue. It's a straightforward environmental issue. We've got to do certain things with the transportation and the energy sector and whatever. No, it's a coordination issue, because you have to have enough people that have a shared worldview around what is true, what is real, what the problem is, that they can come up with adequate solutions, and that a major chunk of humanity isn't fighting against them to keep it from happening because they have a different worldview or different assessment, right? And let's say that your solution involves whatever, some kind of carbon tax or something that countries have to agree to. And agreement without enforcement ends up being a very tricky thing. And how do you do enforcement internationally with superpowers that have nukes? So let's say that the US and Europe were to agree to some kind of taxation policy which decreased their near-term GDP growth, but was good for the environment long-term. And we'd all say, well, that makes sense. But then let's say China doesn't, and we have a concern about China seeking to be a global dominant empire. And if we can't enforce them to, because what enforcement mechanisms are we going to use that don't create war? Then does that just basically, and that increased GDP ends up being that they have relative to everyone else equals increased globalization and military powers? Are we just ceding the control of the world to China? Like, that's a very real set of theory of trade-off considerations. So your assessment of climate change can't be separate from your assessment of geopolitics and underlying economics. And so we don't assess the problems in a deep enough, interconnected enough way to come up with good solutions. And we don't have enough shared sense making that enough of the world wants to do the same things, right? So we can
what
say,
what do you mean by sense making? What's that mean?
what is actually real? Is climate change at all, right? So if you talk to some environmentalists, like very good ones, like Lovelock, it's not only real, but it's already too late. There's nothing we can do about it, and the Earth will become uninhabitable. Other people say it's a very serious thing. It's on its way to that, but we still have time. There are other people that think that it's a real thing, but it's not that serious. The Earth changes, will migrate. And there are other people that think it's an utter hoax, right? Sense making. Have we been able to make sense of the world that we live in well enough to inform what we think are right choices? So when we think about democracy or republic, what we're talking about is a collective choice-making system. How do we not just make choice, me as an individual in my family or an individual economic actor choosing to buy or sell something, but we're going to share roads, we're going to share defense, we're going to decide that it does make sense to start that war or not. So in autocracy, we just basically, the power is ceded to whoever it is that's going to make that choice. But in a participatory governance, we're supposed to participate to do collective choice making. The basis of choice making, collective choice making, is collective sense making about what we think is actually happening, and sense making about what we think the effect of a particular injunction might be, and meaning making. What do we think is important that we're in service to? And communication, our ability to converse effectively enough with each other that we can get on the same page about this so that we can do collective choice making. So choice making has as its antecedents sense making, as its prerequisite, sense making, meaning making, and communication.
And just to jump into sense making, you're reminding me of thinking of an ecology, right? And there's usually a keystone species of that you could kind of like point at and be like, for example, in Colombia, the jaguar. The jaguar's health is great. The Amazon's good. If it's not, Amazon's bad, right? It's a very simple way. So if we think of sense making as a term you mentioned earlier, which was beautiful, an information ecology, right? You take this information ecology and make sense of it. How is there something as simple as a keystone species where you could just be like, yeah, we're that the health of our sense making right now, it's fundamentally on the decline. It's not healthy. Is there something that we can point at that, or many things that we can point at where we're like, guys, our sense making ability is often, and in this model you described, it's almost like reminds me of the story of the princess and the pea, right? She's sleeping on a pea. She's so sensitive that if a pea is under her bed, it affects her, right? And so there's this almost a butterfly effect, a better approach of if this is off, right? How can we show people that this is off or that it's not? I think that should be a helpful place for us to start.
So I appreciate that as I'm sharing things, individual things I'm saying are sparking interest, and you're wanting to go down those avenues. What I also noticed, you've got about 6 strands open, which would actually be necessary to close to do a good job of this. And I apologize that part of looking at things in a more interconnected way means the chunk size is a little larger. And that's
sure.
An important thing for people to understand, is that you can't fit a good assessment of anything into a tweet or into a short news bite. So an attention span...
Forgive me, I'm a millennial.
When attention spans go down, you become a worse sense maker for sure, because you have to compress the complexity of reality into something that will fit into the tiny attention. And so actually expanding attention to be able to hold multiple views, multiple epistemologies, all of the relevant things, so that you can then come up with a solution that's actually adequate is requisite. So I have heard is there a butterfly effect to affect sense making? Let me try to close a couple loops that maybe will bring it together.
Great.
So we want to improve human coordination. We want to improve our sense making, where we all are better at having the capability of doing assessment of what is actually true, base reality. And you can see in the US right now, hydroxychloroquine is a wonder drug. It's an utter farce that actually kills more people if they use it. Masks really help. Masks make it worse. Systemic racism is this most critical issue in the nation. Systemic racism isn't even a thing in police violence, when statistically corrected, is worse for white people. On and on, right? China is trying to become a globally dominant empire, and it's very close, or they're not. There's maximally polarized views around just base reality, because these aren't values. These are, is something true, right? So clearly we are not doing a good job at collective sense making. So when we say we want to get collective coordination, we want to get our ability for everyone to actually know what is true empirically well, for us to be able to identify what values we're trying to serve, and be able to hear the values someone else is trying to serve, and say, are there better strategies that can serve these simultaneously? Maybe I care about the environment here. Maybe you care about your kids being able to get good jobs. And there's a particular proposition that's crafted in a way where if it goes through, your kids get good jobs and the environment's fucked, and vice versa. So I have to pretend like I don't care about kids getting good jobs. You have to pretend like you don't care about the environment, because the proposition is based on that theory of trade-offs. And I've now collapsed my values into a strategy to achieve them. But if I said, wait, I care about this, you care about that, is there a better proposition we can come up with for what could achieve both of them? So we separate the value from the strategy to achieve it. You can see that it almost seems mind-bogglingly ridiculous that we have a democracy where you vote on a proposition where you weren't involved in crafting what is a good proposition. So some special interest group that has a very narrow interest puts forward a proposition and markets it to a group of people where it's directly beneficial to them. And this is why almost every proposition gets about half the vote yes and half the vote no, which also means that it inherently polarizes the population, which is why democracies die younger. One of the main reasons is it's actually very hard to get lots of people to coordinate. It's very easy to have one person rule or a small number of people rule. And if you're creating a voting system where the people aren't doing good proposition creation first, it is necessarily polarizing, because the thing that you're voting for seems like it's actively trying to harm what is meaningful and sacred to me, and vice versa. So since the beginning of the thing we call civilization, very few total people have lived in democracies or republics. Almost everybody has lived in feudalism or autocracy of some kind. Democracies have emerged just a few times in rare little pockets. And when they've emerged, they have emerged following periods of cultural enlightenments. This is a really key insight. The cultural enlightenment, because this is going to come to your butterfly effect.
Yeah.
The cultural enlightenment, so the Athenian democracy, with all of its flaws, still a movement in the direction of more participatory governance, emerged out of a kind of Greek Enlightenment that valued everyone's ability to do better sense making. So let's really value education and the development of the individual. So everyone should learn history and formal logic and grammar and rhetoric and et cetera, so they can all actually make sense of base reality on their own and make good choices. And then they all also need the Socratic method, which means that they can argue any point. They can take other people's perspective well. And you can see how profoundly broken down that capacity and that value and orientation currently is. If you have a bunch of people that can make sense of reality directly on their own, not listen to what some authority said and decide which of the authorities they listen to, but direct empirical capacity, and then they can take each other's perspective, those people can have a conversation that will end up resulting in some ability for effective compromise and movement forward. But if the capacity for sense-making conversation breaks down, then the basis that gave rise to the democracy or republic being able to emerge breaks down. And so we can see that in the US came out of the European Enlightenment, where there was this kind of Renaissance idea of you don't just have to be a specialist at one thing, you can have a deep background in lots of things. science, we can actually empirically all get a good base understanding of reality, and the Hegelian dialectic will always seek for any thesis an antithesis and then a higher order synthesis. Can we take multiple perspectives and try to find higher order reconciliation? That the underlying public education and fourth estate or news that are required for people to all be developed in their capacity to make sense of the world and participate in governance and to know what's going on have went through enough institutional decay that nobody really has a sense of what's going on, or to the degree they do, they are outraged and certain about things that half the population thinks that they're desperately wrong about, right? That they're outraged and certain about. So we can look at this as the collapse of the American empire, because you don't have the ability for a real republic, because you don't have participatory governments, because the prerequisites aren't there. Mm-hmm. We can also look at it in a bigger way, which is we can, and this will then wrap up, we can look at the breakdown of the first ever globalized world order that has been since World War II. Because of course, empires got larger as time went on, and there was a game theoretic competition for more size. British Empire was not quite a world-ruling empire, but after World War II, it was the first time that we could never have a war again between the major empires. We always had war between major empires, but they never had a nuke. They never had utterly catastrophic tech that made a war that no one could win. And so after World War II, we had to do something unprecedented and say, how do we never have a war between the major parties again? And so we said, well, we have to be so economically interdependent that it's never advantageous to bomb each other, because it is better to coordinate with each other. And so let's do globalization and have supply chains that interconnect us in such a way that we don't survive without import and export. Well, in a way that made sense, right? And we had proxy wars, but we didn't have major wars from then till now. But it also created one global civilization, really, because none of the nations really can operate on their own. A global civilization mediated by globalism that is profoundly fragile, where breakdown, a virus in one part of the world can become a virus in the entire world, can start breaking down supply chains, breaking down social fabric within countries, between countries. And so COVID was just a big enough thing to show the systemic fragility. And the systemic fragility that's been cascading is really like the second and third order effects are really just starting to show up, and will continue for some time. And obviously, when we look at the social tension that arose with George Floyd, it was a long-term issue. But after a tremendous amount of unemployment, of course, there's going to be more likelihood for violence in the street, because when people's fundamental needs aren't met, you always get more willingness for violence. And so even that was one of the secondary effects of COVID type effects. So what we're experiencing right now also is that the globalized world order, the kind of Bretton Woods agreements put in place, are breaking down, or almost totally broken down. The US has pulled out of NATO, out of WHO, decreased to the UN, and the major empires, the biggest countries in the world, are doing cyber attacks on each other and espionage, and they know it. So it's not following peacetime agreements. It's basically unconventional war rather than conventional kinetic war, but it can.
All right, hang tight, everyone. We're going to be getting.
So we have a breakdown of the global order, and we have a breakdown of the country that
and
was leading the global order kind of simultaneously. And then we have a very big question of, so what happens next?
Wade Davis,
do we have
together,
increasing chaos and
by,
population reduction, catastrophic risk writ large? Do we have China
so
moving
to
hanging
in here.
Actually increasing their coherent capacity to build trains all around the world and ports and whatever, and they run the world? And what does that look like? Or at the end of where the US has decayed to, can we reboot something like a meaningful participatory governance? If you were to want to reboot it, you have to drive a cultural enlightenment that is the prerequisite. This is the butterfly, is the high value on everyone's capacity to do much better sense making and much higher quality conversation so they can participate.
I think this is the exact conversation I want you and Wade to to kind of discuss and digest, and that was beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, how are you feeling? Do you want to take a breath? How about we all take a breath and then we'll come back with Wade?
Sure.
Okay, great. I think it's almost like you've opened the connection of where both of you really fit in together. And I think now the audience gets both of you really well, where you're coming from. And I'm excited. Really fit in together. And I think now the audience gets both of you really well, where you're coming from. And I'm excited. Really fit in together. And I think now the audience gets both of you really well, where you're coming from. And I'm excited.
Hey everyone, keep hanging out for a sec. We're trying this new thing where we beam a Zoom call onto the inside of the Playa Alchemist pyramid here. We'll get it straightened out in just a moment.
Really fit in together. And I think now the audience gets both of you really well, where you're coming from. And I'm excited. Really fit in together. And I think now the audience gets both of you really well, where you're coming from. And I'm excited. Really fit in together. And I think now the audience gets both of you really well, where you're coming from. And I'm excited to bring us all together and see what emerges. All of us. Thank you too for being here. This feels like such a poignant conversation this time. And what I find interesting about the two of you is that you guys are pointing at, I think, something very similar. And you're stumbling on it in two different ways. You're coming at it from two different angles. Wade, cultural anthropologist, storyteller. And you wrote this article you've shared with me, and feel free to expand on, you just feel like something had to be said.
Yeah, I mean,
I just
was going to say that, you introduced me to Daniel when we first connected, and I just loved listening to him. And when I was just listening to your conversation, it struck me that just how important it is to know history. I was just reading earlier today one of the classic books about Vietnam by Stanley Karnoff, and you just see how those men, Robert McNamara and Dean Rusk and Johnson and all their kind of various advisors, the scores of them, were just stumbling around in that void, doing what they tried to do, and it's almost agonizing to be reading the contemporary accounts of their decision making in 1963 to 4 to 5, knowing what was going to be the result, and the kind of analysis that Daniel just did, taking us through the patterns of history. He quoted Churchill, and another one of, I think, Churchill's saying, I think it was Churchill who said that, if you don't study history, you'll never, you're condemned to repeat the same mistakes over and over and over again. And in my little analysis of the COVID thing, what made it, I suppose, unique, and certainly what caused it to hit a nerve, is just the point of view, the kind of the anthropological lens that I was thinking of this less as a story of medicine than of culture. But Daniel takes us to a whole nother level of depth, right? And it raises the issue of how astonishing the important knowledge of history is for anyone who has the audacity to think that they can lead us or lead anyone, right? And it's not trivial, that George Patton knew classical warfare of the Greeks in the the Mediterranean zone. It's not an accident that Churchill won the Nobel Prize for Literature and wrote more books than most contemporary politicians have read. And when you think of the most horrifying many horrifying aspects of the current administration in Washington, the word ignorant is really means without knowledge, lack of gnosis, right? And when you have a president who literally doesn't know when World War II began, who doesn't know the most fundamental aspects of history, who has never read anything, who famously doesn't read. And then when you contrast that to what we just heard from Daniel, unraveling the threads of history, the mystic connections of history that have brought us to where we are. My overwhelming impression listening to him is just how important, how vital a knowledge of history is in the moment, and certainly for those who have the gumption and the audacity to believe that they have the right to lead the rest of us.
And interesting, as you're saying that, I was thinking about what you were speaking of is this Asian century, will it be Chinese led? And Xi Jinping is a very serious scholar of history, political theory, philosophy, military history. My understanding is actually a very serious translator and scholar of all of the kind of classic Chinese works. And that when he came to power, the people who were in high positions of the CCP all had to have a pretty high degree of background and training in the 36 stratagems and the art of war and the warring states region. And you can imagine if the US Senate and Congress all had to have the whole kind of history of Western philosophy and the canon and the Napoleonic Wars and Alexander the Great, and et cetera, it'd be a different story. And kind of the founding fathers did, right? And this is one of the institutional things, is that when you're trying to emerge, you have to work really hard, but there's a way of kind of getting fat when you are the dominant empire and you've forgotten the problems, and the very hard work of staying actively educated and engaged doesn't seem immediately eminently necessary. And that's one of the things that leads to the decay.
I think that's so true. I mean, the famous quip by Kennedy when he welcomed all the Nobel laureates to the White House, and he said there wasn't as much intellectual firepower in that room since the last time Thomas Jefferson dined alone. And I think that's so true. I mean, there's an understandable but a kind of a disturbing American almost embrace of ignorance. There's a if you know too much, you're sort of you're not really a man or something. Certainly we're until 9/11, the vast majority of congressmen didn't even own passports. And one of the things that I've noticed, I used to lecture on private jet trips for the National Geographic that would go around the world. And they were very, very expensive trips for people. And generally the individuals who came along were really wonderful people, very, very affluent by definition. And they had all had incredibly successful careers, but their careers had focused on making the most hospital beds or something, or running this corporation and being a real expert on packaged meats or something like that. But outside of that expertise, outside of golf, football, and sports, there just wasn't. It wasn't as if a general education was deemed to be that essential to corporate affairs. I mean, I used to go through this with my own father-in-law, who was very well read compared to normal politicians, but he was a most beloved man, the most wonderful man, the greatest, the embodiment of everything that a great American is, in my opinion. But he was Senate Foreign Relations Committee chairman. Almost president. He was offered the vice presidency by Richard Nixon, and he turned it down. He supported Rockefeller, yet when he came to visit us at our fish camp in northern British Columbia, guidebook in hand, he came over to me and said, "Wade, did you know Canada was the second biggest country on earth?" And then he was very desperate to have a newspaper, and the nearest newspaper we could get for him was a 4-day-old copy of the Toronto Globe and Mail. It's a bush pilot brought in. And Granddaddy's sitting there by the fire, very, very content with the newspaper at last. But then he quizzically looks at me, pulls down the newspaper, and looks up from his bifocals and said, "Wade, why is there so much news on Canada in this newspaper?" And those are kind of not gentle cliches. And obviously Granddaddy at that point was past his prime. So I'm not being in any way, but there is this this sense that to know too much is to be almost suspect in the United States. And I don't think that was certainly true in the Kennedy era. Maybe they thought they knew too much in the case of someone like McNamara, but certainly, knowledge of the world has never been a credential for political office in the United States.
I'll share a couple thoughts on partly how I think we got here. And it's by no means a comprehensive addressing, because I think there's actually quite a few threads that are involved. What makes someone particularly good in the market and what makes them comprehensively educated about history don't necessarily overlap all that well. And doing very well in the market means that you can influence DC to have people do your bidding, and the people who are susceptible to do that will do better and whatever. So there's a whole bunch of other reasons, but a couple reasons that maybe are slightly less often thought about and valuable. One is, I think the focus in the types of knowledge that mattered coming out of World War II made a very drastic shift to STEM focus because of the critical role that technology played in the war. And we can see that it was like we built the entire Manhattan Project around Oppenheimer and like a few people who had really asymmetric technological and physical insights. And Bletchley Park around, and a couple major things around Turing and von Neumann that pretty much determined the war, right? Like the bomb and the computer, and then
Synthetic rubber.
Yeah,
Synthetic rubber was the third example.
And Sputnik getting there first, I think there was this very real sense of, and one way to look at World War II was the competition between the US and the Russians for the German scientists. And not just, so Operation Paperclip here and the Russian version of it. There's the famous joke that who would win the Cold War between the USSR and USA was who got the better Nazi scientists. But like it played a significant role. But I think there became a very heavy focus in let's focus on STEM. But George Washington said it should be the primary aim of this government to train every single citizen in the science of government. And the science of government meant history, politics, game theory, courtier dynamics, etc. Because if they didn't understand it, those who did would run everything, and it would become a kleptocracy and then an oligarchy or some weird thing, not a democracy. So I think the civics training became very de-emphasized. That's one part. The other part I think is very important is, and this is, so I'm going to say something that I think is more sympathetic with the anti-intellectual movement, is I think the anti-intellectual movement was a game theoretic counter strategy to intellectualism used as a political weapon. And things can be true that are not representative of the whole truth, right? Like one of the things I see all the time is people say, well, obviously herbs and supplements and peptides don't really work that well because there aren't that many phase 3 clinical trials showing that they work, and there are for pharmameds. Well, there's no fucking money because there's no patentability on any of those things. Of course, they'll never get phase 3 trials. And the phase 3 trials that showed that Premarin worked or Vioxx worked didn't mean that they didn't kill massive numbers of people, because what's included in the scope of the safety analysis. And so it's true, those phase 3 clinical trials are true. And if you are literate, you understand that they're true, but they're not representative, right? Because if here's the whole space of possible health interventions, the ones that are profitable will get the most research, and they represent this space. So then the preponderance of data is an uneven distribution, right? So similarly, I can put an IPCC together and say all of the stuff on climate change, but it doesn't but DC still running the benign China hypothesis and not looking at that particular issue seriously. Bannon was actually a big part of, and Trump delivering the US from the benign China hypothesis. So there was a way that I see that throughout history, whenever something becomes a source of legitimate authority, whether it's the church or academia, then there's so much power in being the one who says what is true, that then anyone who's very good at the game of power has a maximum incentive to try to capture and influence that legitimate authority. So the legitimate authority starts getting influenced by who's funding it and how the prestige networks work and those types of things. So then legitimate authority in the US started to have a particular set of political biases that a lot of people in the US didn't feel represented their interests well. And so, but they couldn't argue against the IPCC thing well, but they could feel like it was not aligned with their interests. So anti-intellectualism, since they couldn't compete at it, was actually their counter weapon. I just won't engage with the weapons that you're using that feel like they're against me. And so one of the ways I think to actually have sense making really be able to be pervasive is that it is not weaponized for partial political or economic agendas, that it is authentically seeking to understand the entire space and be in the benefit of everyone, as opposed to that as a virtue signal. Otherwise, I think anti-intellectualism becomes a natural counter weapon.
Let me ask you about China, because one of the things that was interesting in the criticism of my article, I was a number of people, Jeffrey Sachs for one, a friend of mine who founded Code Pink, quite liberal individual, were very critical of my last paragraph when I essentially said we'll miss the American era if China is in control. And I cited in that the treatment of the Uyghurs, the social contracts, the social capital thing, and just the treatment of democracy, et cetera. And there's a sort of thing on the left that we're now bashing China. And is that the left being reflexively counter to whatever Trump is doing because Trump's bashing China, therefore we shouldn't bash China. And then you parse it down and you see that Jeffrey Sachs is up to his eyeballs in contracts with the Chinese government. And I know that in my travels around the world, I've seen the footprint of China virtually everywhere. I mean, just if you can build your way to dominance, that's what they're doing. I mean, the police station in Rarotonga, the opera house in Dakar, an interchange in Togo, in Lomé, the capital of Togo. I mean, obviously the Belt Initiative, but also great roads across the Amazon, and I've also, of course, seen firsthand what has happened to Tibet. And there seems to be this thing, as long as China does development work, it's, in other words, build stuff, that somehow it's okay, and that they're not, and that gets back into this whole thing where genocide is universally condemned, but ethnocide, the destruction of people's life, is not only not condemned, it's considered proper development policy in many quarters. So what is your sense of China and the next century?
Yeah, it's such a critical question. I don't claim to know what's in Xi Jinping's mind or what the internal plans and sense-making of the CCP are. And nor do I represent that whatever those are represents the actual will of all the Chinese people outside of Beijing, which it obviously doesn't.
Let me just sort of interrupt, Daniel, but you're so right in that. I mean, there is a terrible tendency in the West to see China as this monolith, when in fact, of course, it's remarkably diverse, ethnically, vast country, vast numbers of people, vast orientations, and so on. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm not going to say that there aren't some people who have a xenophobic, racist relationship just because it seems big and scary and they don't like the big scary things, so they make it the Chinese monolith. Of course, there is some reactive, non-thinking part of that. I wouldn't say that that is much dumber than the benign China hypothesis was. I would say those are kind of equally not clear assessments. I think The 100-Year Marathon is a particularly interesting book around China's long-term plan starting in, give or take, 1949, and that is kind of tracking quite well. I think we've had a period where nobody remembers in their own lived experience very serious war in the developed world. And so they don't really have any embodied sense that that's even a thing. So their actual sense of history is quite bad, right? Like their embodied sense is quite bad. And so they don't recognize that like slavery and genocide and initiating war and empire has been kind of the story for the whole history of civilization. Everybody, like, it's not just been European white slavery. It was the Ottomans and Turks enslaving Europeans. It was people in Asia in slavery, inter-Asian slavery. It was, Comanche violence with other first tribes people. Like, largely humans have just been kind of violent fucks for a long time, often. And that's an important part of the story. So when we say the US was built on genocide and slavery, and how can it have any kind of moral value, that's a very real story. And like, what do we do for reparations on genocide and slavery? And the whole world was in a context of slavery and genocide. Arguably, you could say British colonialism was less violent than Dutch or Spanish or some of the other colonialisms. You go to the Congo and whatever in some ways. So this is why the historical context is important. And so then I'm going to think of China in light of that. If I put myself in my imagining of Xi's position, I'm actually quite empathetic to everything he's doing. And in some ways, I can say it's the smartest thing anyone in the world is doing, because there are some critical problems that it appears he's paying attention to that no one else is even paying earnest attention to. So I'm very empathetic to the solutions he has. That doesn't mean I like the solutions or want them to happen. So just to kind of briefly frame that, rule of law requires a monopoly of violence. If you don't have a monopoly of violence, how do you enforce rule of law? If we say you can't cut down the parks, but the dudes who are cutting down the trees have bigger guns than the police do, then you can cut down the parks, right? Well, how do you have monopoly of violence when individuals or small groups can make catastrophic weapons that can destroy whole cities and whatever, because exponential tech makes that possible, where I can get access to CRISPR gene drives and people in their basement can make bioweapons, or drones with thermite bombs that are like easy to make, that can take out massive aspects of infrastructure. This problem of, I can do way more damage with an AR-15 than a knife, but I can do way more damage with a CRISPR gene drive than an AR-15. And it was very hard to make nukes. I needed nation state capacity to make nukes, but I don't need nation state capacity to make drone weapons. And so we have an emerging world where decentralized, or cyber weapons that can take out infrastructure. We have a place where decentralized exponential tech makes the world frail in a way that there's no precedent in all of history for. This is why we need history, and we also need imagination, right? And forecasting. And so what do we do about that? What do we do when people can, in their basement, not just be going crazy and getting an AR-15 with a lot of clips, but they can be building CRISPR weapons? China's answer is there is no answer other than ubiquitous surveillance. You need ubiquitous surveillance to be able to suppress a harm that is that great, and the harm of the suppression is less bad than the harm of doing that thing. And that's actually kind of understandable, right? And they're also not in the position of seeing that the US as having been as like innocent and rosy as a lot of people in the US do, because from the outside, the predatory debt lending they've been doing all over the world for the last 20 years. We were doing for a lot longer than that. They just kind of took the World Bank model, copied it, and made it better. The wars that we waged, whatever. So I'm very empathetic to why China is doing what it's doing. And I'm actually very impressed with its ability to build high-speed trains all around the world when we can't fix roads, right? Autocracy with no term limit, so you can do 100-year planning with no internal coordination costs, is an amazing system to build shit. That said, I think if anyone who's concerned about racism in the US doesn't look at the Chinese treatment of the Uyghur and take very seriously what is its actual view towards racial justice, like demonstrably. And if the way we're dealing with it in the US is leading to increasing division of the US, which leads to the rapidity of its breakdown, which is ceding the 21st century to Chinese AI technologically empowered autocracy with that value system, are we just being short-sighted as fuck about actual racism over the next century or any other issue like that? I think Xi also has paid attention to civilizational collapse better, because he also has a longer history, right? China has a much longer history. And so he knows that civilizational collapse happens because you get overthrown externally, you have internal dissent, or you run out of resources. So he's worked to have a 100-year resource acquisition plan, which Belt and Road and String of Pearls and whatever are part of. The Sesame credit system and the IoT surveillance system ensures that internal dissent can't happen. And an adequate military ensures that nobody can overthrow them without catastrophic risk to themselves. But any people should think about, how do I prevent our own people from going through civilizational collapse? So like, I'm simultaneously very empathetic with and want answers really better than those answers.
Well, and there's another thing that I think that people in the West fail to understand, is just the reflex for order that goes back to the whole Confucian ideology, and you realize what China has actually endured over the last 150 years, not just the humiliation leading to the Boxer Rebellion, but the Great Leap Forward, which led to 48 million people dying of starvation, the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, 35 million people dying in the Civil War and World War II. I mean, it's no wonder that the Chinese citizenry is perfectly happy with the stability that the social credit system is invoking. I mean, the polls say that Chinese people like it because they just want order, predictability.
I wouldn't say I could trust those polls because of the credit system. There's a self-reinforcing dynamic.
Right, of course.
My sense is, from what I have heard of people who have lived and spent a lot of time throughout various regions of China, is that the further you get in actual miles outside of Beijing, the less kind of CCP standard narrative that people hold. And it's large enough that as powerful as the CCP is, it still can't unify 1 point whatever it is, 5-8 billion people. We think the number is probably a lot higher than the reported number, all that well. Like that's a hard thing to do. And this actually, one of my concerns is, I think the benign China hypothesis of like, no, China's just trying to grow its people, they're not trying to become a world empire, don't worry about it, is completely dreadful. But also Chinese are the great bad guys is the only thing that could unify all of China against the West, right? Because the people who are there like Louis Vuitton and they like Silicon Valley and they like Hollywood, but they won't if the message they keep hearing is that Americans don't like the Chinese.
No, I think
So I really want to separate the view of the Chinese from a particular regime.
Well, and there's a whole issue of face and you know, which comes to shove, the motherland is the motherland, and no, that's fascinating. You should write a book about this. I think
You've got 23 books, which is impressive, and I have none. So my best chance of any of this being in a book is you and I having conversations.
Well, listen, this has been really wonderful, both of you guys. I've got to pull off actually for some family stuff on Labor Day weekend, but
Absolutely.
I've really, Satya and Daniel, I really want to keep in touch with you, man. I've really enjoyed both this dialogue and our previous one on the phone. So it's
Likewise.
an honor to be with you, man.
Thank you,
Thank you
Wade.
so much, Wade. Thank you for your time. Thank you for
Thank you, everybody.
just honoring us with your presence and attention, and thank you for your work.
Great. Thanks, Satya.
Genuinely appreciate it.
Okay, Daniel.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Great.
And the team who put this on, appreciate it.
I'm gonna turn my video on, and can we turn my video on? I would love to thank everyone. Great. Wow. Daniel, Wade, thank you so much. We here at Apply Alchemist really believe that was your viewpoints, your messages, the work that you guys have been spending your lifetimes really bringing together is just so important to give voice to in this moment. So thank you for giving voice to it. Thank you for doing it. Thank you for being it. Thank you for coming together here in this multiverse of a virtual pyramid of Burning Man. I want to take a moment and thank the entire team that brought this together. I want to thank the builders, the build crew. As you can imagine, the crew that built this pyramid was a little different than the one that built last year's pyramid. I just completely amazed with what they were able to create. If you're in the pyramid and you give us some emoji love, that'd be amazing. I want to thank the co-founders of this camp.
All right, everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you from AltSpace VR. Thank you from this particular
Eugene,
burner
Brian,
who's speaking to you right now.
Katie,
thank you
Keegan,
from Apply Alchemist.
Genevieve, Drew, Yunji.
Thanks for being here. Thanks
This has
for
been a
being
week
part
of getting to know you guys, to really kind of be in the trenches with y'all.
So we're gonna have this one again.
You reminded me of what Burning Man's all about.
There's still plenty
People
more.
coming
There's
together,
still plenty more to explore.
putting aside their differences. And
I
creating
don't
something
take.
beautiful.
That's one of the good things about this.
Thank you all for that.
This Sunday is that
Thank you all in
we
the
don't have
audience.
to spend all our time tearing down camp.
Give us your time and attention.
So it's my hope that there's going
Please
to
look
be
out for an incredible.
some Burning Man for you to taste tomorrow, and the
I
next
don't know
day.
what to call it.
and the
Maybe
next
like a
day,
mini doc of
until
this whole
we're able to come
experience.
back together in the dust. Thanks everyone for being here. This is Druffin.
It's been amazing. I was extremely skeptical
Man, I love
coming
that.
into this burn, and
Oh, thanks everyone. Make some friends.
This was one of my most
I
profound
think
burns
that I'm
ever,
still
and it was
stuck.
because of
I
all
can't
of you that
mute
showed up.
everyone here.
So thank you all.
But it's been really tremendous. As